Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 19th of November of 2023. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first I would like to start with Kiev, with Ukraine, with the global updates. And today the Ukrainian government TV channels, propaganda, published the video, the interview with the Azov soldier, the soldier from Azov 3rd Battalion. That, if you remember, this battalion used to attack and storm Klishchiivka and Avdiivka area. So these forces are responsible, or at least were responsible for that area, at least during the summer, during the Ukraine's greatest counteroffensive. As you can see on this video, we see a very happy young man and who was talking with the interviewer, and he was talking mainly about the forces, about the number of forces, and to be more precise, about the age of forces, about average age of the soldiers. And he was saying that it's time to start mobilization of young people, 18s, 20s years old, not like 50, 40 years old, because they're very old. They can't do a lot of things, he's telling us, but they're not, we can't compare like 50 years old soldier with 18, 20 years young man who just finished school, he's in a very good physical conditions and so on. So this is not like something that took place as like accidentally. Of course, and this is the upcoming propaganda in Ukraine, and we need to understand one important thing, because now we have like the Russian progress, that the Russians, let's say, are defeating the Ukrainians in Zaporizhzhia and in the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, South Donetsk area. The Russians have progress in Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, and of course in Syrisk and Lyman and Kupiansk direction. And sometimes, as I'm talking about myself, sometimes I have a feeling that the Russians are winning, and not like a feeling, but sometimes I have a feeling that Ukrainians are about to surrender. This is like a better words to describe the situation. But when talking about the Ukrainian surrender, I'm asking myself, but what is the Ukrainian surrender? How is the Ukrainian surrender? And when I ask myself this question today, after I watched that interview, I find a very interesting thing, that Ukrainian army can be split in two parts: the regular forces, the soldiers who were mobilized on the streets of Ukrainian cities, and of course this is like the majority of army, and the second part of Ukrainian army, the core part of Ukrainian army, is the national battalions. And that guy that we just saw, who was interviewed in Kiev, is the part of Ukrainian core army. And of course Zelensky and the NATO countries don't want to risk with this core army, because the number and the quality and the quantity of this army is enough to control the entire Ukraine, to control the combat line. And until the Ukrainians have their core army, nobody is going to surrender. Zelensky basically can't surrender, because the soldiers, the core army, will easily replace him, or do whatever they like with him, and they will put their own men and continue this war. So this is the situation. Now let's move to the situation on the ground, and let's start from Kherson direction. According to information we have, as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 20 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems Type B. The Russians continue bombardments of Ukrainian footholds in the vicinity of Antonovka on the Russian side of the river Dnipro River, Pidstepnoye, Pyshanovka. We have received almost nothing from Krynki foothold, so probably after very heavy clashes that took place during the previous 6 weeks, both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, are making some rotations, regrouping before the next week, before upcoming week, when they will restart the clashes for this territory. Now we are moving further to another important update. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they managed to discover the Russian air defense system Panzer S-1 that cost around $15 million. I don't know why the Ukrainians took a decision to note about this, and as a result of HIMARS strike, that air defense system was destroyed. So this is the current situation in Kherson direction. Let's take a look at this explosion. Yes, that's it. When talking about Zaporizhzhia area, today we also got a lot of very interesting and sometimes weird updates, and the first update is coming from the village by the name of Tavriska. This one. The village is located on the north of Orekhov and on the south, let's say, east from the city, from the village by the name of Zarechna. I'll explain to you why I noted this Zarechna. On this video, we see another concentration of Ukrainian forces. We see another Russian drone flying above this territory who control and collect the information. At some point, the Russians attack this territory with Tornado S system. And as a result of that strike, as you can see, another Ukrainian ammo depot, probably headquarters, were destroyed. This is very important because I'll remind you that just since the beginning of November, the Russians have already made 2 strikes in the village by the name of Zarechna. As a result of those strikes, the Russians managed to destroy the Ukrainian headquarters of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. The Russians attacked this brigade twice, and as a result of those attacks, that brigade basically was head off, and so that's why it's very weird why the Ukrainians still haven't learned any lessons from those 2 strikes, and as a result of another strike, probably the Ukrainians lost another headquarters of another Ukrainian brigade on this direction. Meanwhile, the Russians continue bombardments and artillery preparation in the village by the name of Kamyanska. On this scene, we can see the Russian bombardments of the city. Probably the Ukrainians use this territory for the concentration of forces, and I'll remind you that on this direction we have very fierce clashes from the Russian side on the line between Lugovo, Zhiribyanki, and Petykhatki. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received any updates about any progress of the Russians. When talking about Robotyne, as we discussed in the previous video, there was a very weird video from the Ukrainian side, from the Russian side. Let's take a look at this video one more time. The Ukrainians during the previous night made an attempt to attack Russian positions in Novoprokopovka, and the Ukrainians have almost reached the village from the north, but not getting like another 300 meters. For some reason, the Ukrainians took a decision to turn their convoy and to step back, and then the Ukrainians start running away basically from Novoprokopovka. As you can see, the Russians were attacking the retreating forces with anti-tank missiles, and as a result of some strikes, some armored vehicles were destroyed. Later, this video we have already seen in the morning update, and later we got another update from this territory. This is the armored vehicle that was destroyed, and we see the Ukrainian Bradley probably, and how the Ukrainian forces start landing in this area, and they brought some infantry, and the Ukrainians basically launched an offensive operation. Very weird video, because I don't understand Ukrainian behavior. If we take a look at this video if we'll try to understand and analyze, the Ukrainians started their movement from the north, somewhere from this line in Robotyne. They managed to reach almost the northern part of Novoprokopovka. On this line, they turned to the right and in direction of the road between Novoprokopovka and Verbova, and from this point they start beginning moving to the north back to Robotyne. So that was the hood that the Ukrainians made for some reason. At this point, one Ukrainian armored vehicle was destroyed. At this point, the Ukrainian soldiers landed in this territory and basically established control over these fortifications right in front of Novoprokopovka. Why they took a decision to act like this, I don't know, because later the Russians published the video how they were bombing and attacking the trenches that Ukrainians have just captured as a result of that operation. So I'm not sure whether the Ukrainians managed to achieve anything in that operation, but I know for sure that during that operation the Ukrainians lost at least 2 armored vehicles, and the territories that were captured by their assault soldiers were under very heavy fire with the multi-launch rocket systems. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Zaporizhzhia direction, as a result of artillery duels, bombardments, and so on, the Ukrainians lost around 100 soldiers, 14 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system. Furthermore, the Russians published a series of videos of their attacks with the drones on the line between Kopony and Novodanilovka. So I don't remember when we got updates from this territory for the last time, but as I understand, the Ukrainians maybe made some rotation and concentrated their forces on this line. So basically, I believe we can expect some activation of their clashes on this direction as well within the next 24 or 48 hours. Now we are moving to Orilskyi area to the south Donetsk direction. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 145 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system Krab. As you can see, when talking about Vremivka tactical bridgehead, we have just one geolocation, but probably this is one of the most important geolocations for the previous 24 hours. On this video, we see the usage of the Russian analog of as the usage of the Russian cluster rounds. But this is not just the cluster rounds. This is RBK 500. This is aviation bombs, 500 kilos bombs that have a lot of almost 1,500 sub bombs inside of this bomb. And as you can see, there is like every single bomb make a small fire. And this is not just a fire, because if we compare the Western analog that Ukrainians use cluster rounds and the Russians, the Ukrainians don't have these fire signs from every single explosion. You see this? The Ukrainians cluster rounds doesn't have this feature. And this is like a very powerful feature that can penetrate like defense belts, like a very powerful armor of armored vehicles or even of trenches and strongholds on the ground. So the Russians start using much powerful cluster rounds in comparison with the cluster rounds that Ukrainians have. And based on the geolocation, we see that the Russians are trying to reduce or destroy or to prepare the pass from Priutina in direction of the Staromayorskaya flanks. Obviously, after those bombardments, nothing that were located in this area could survive after that strike. So also I expect within the next 24-48 hours another Russian attempt to attack in direction of Staromayorskaya positions. Now we are moving to South Donetsk direction, to the classical South Donetsk. The Russians continue bombardments of Konstantinovka. The quality of this video is very poor, but on this video we see how the Russians were bombing the main logistic roads that goes from Marinka to Vuhledar. On Krasnogorovka direction, according to information we have, the Russians launched artillery preparation, very heavy bombardments of this territory, and also there are very high chances that during the next week the Russians will make another attempt to attack in direction of the southern part of Krasnogorovka. During the previous video we have already discussed some episodes of bombardments of this territory, so there are very high chances of restarting of Russian activity. Now we are moving to the most important area, to Avdiivka direction, and as you can see we have a lot of updates from this territory. And the most important geolocation we got from Stepovo or Petrovska, and that video was published by the Ukrainian side. On this video we can see the Ukrainian Leopard who entered and reached the outskirts, the edge positions of Stepovo, positions that used to be a week ago under Russian control. And from this territory the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians from the south to the north. So this is Ukrainian Leopard. He was trying to attack, step back, to move further, attack, step back. So he was on the edge positions, and there were very high chances that this tank might be destroyed by the Russian anti-tank missile. And when the Ukrainian tank complete its job, it's launched the smoke screen and withdraw their position. So that video shown that the Ukrainians at least have control over the southern part of Stepovo, and from this position the Ukrainian tank was attacking the Russians in this area. So this is like the geolocations that clarify and give us some understanding of the situation in the city. And basically, and obviously, some part of this village is under Russian control, another part of this village is under Russian control. So the eastern part probably still remains under the Russian control. So this is something, the configuration of this territory. The Russians continue bombardments, heavy bombardments of Avdiivka. During the day we got a lot of geolocations showing the process of reducing the chemical plant till ruins. The Russians are using FAB 500, maybe FAB even 1000 or 1500. Significant losses from the Ukrainian side, but yet there were updates from the Russian side that the Russians managed to enter to the inside of the chemical plant. That's a part of this territory is in the gray zone, but as I understand that currently those updates, those in piece of news were just speculations. Currently the entire chemical plant is under Ukraine control, but the Russians continue storming process every single day, 24 hours without, it's like unstoppable process. Also, we got report that the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt on the northeastern part and managed to enter this residential area. And the next week, obviously, the Russians will continue their progress, trying to move along this residential area. And this is like the beginning of the clearing of entire Avdiivka. When talking about southern part, we got the same story. The Russians continue using FAB 500. They continue reducing this city till ruins. And as we can see, according to some sources, the Ukrainian defense has been collapsed in this area, according to some Russian sources, of course. And today we got few geolocations, few videos. One we have already discussed. According to this video, the Ukrainians tried to counterattack maybe, or they moved some infantry, but as a result of FPV drone strikes, the entire Ukrainian platoon was destroyed. And we have a lot of messages, like Telegram reports, Telegram messages from the soldiers on the ground. And according to some Russians, they managed to capture significant number of Ukrainian soldiers in this area. They basically surrendered. Also, other sources reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish control over the stronghold by the name of Tsarskaya Khota. This update we got from like unconfirmed resources, not like 100% reliable resources. So we need more updates to verify this information. But for now, this is like the freshest updates that Tsarskaya Khota fell. But we need to wait because it's a very important stronghold, and if it's true, we can say that entire Avdiivka has been collapsed, because without southern defense, there are no defense in Avdiivka at all. Furthermore, the sources are saying that the Ukrainians are planning to leave Avdiivka and withdraw their position, and the only thing that stops the Ukrainians from doing this is that the Ukrainians thought and supposed that highly unlikely that the Russians were able or are able to establish control over Avdiivka. But now we see that things develops in the way that in the months, maybe in 2, the entire Avdiivka will be captured by the Russians. But the thing is that Ukrainians don't have defense built on the Ukrainian side after Avdiivka. So there are like just logistical centers, there are like temporary defense belts or temporary strongholds and so on, and there are no fortifications as we can see inside of Avdiivka or somewhere like in Robotin or something like this. So now the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate as much as possible, as many as possible engineering equipment, and the next defense belt that currently the Ukrainians are planning, are trying to prepare, goes along the line Kurakhova-Selidova and then Novopokrovsk and then to the north in direction of Konstantinovka. So this is the new defense belt that currently the Ukrainians are trying to prepare, not to improve, not to, let's say, to develop. They're trying to create it from scratch. So there is no like defense belt, and this is the reason why the Ukrainians can't withdraw from Avdiivka. They need to win some time. They need to win months, 2 or 3 months, and during this period of time they will try to prepare this defense belt, and then they will be able to withdraw. Because if the Russians are able to capture Avdiivka within the next 2 weeks, basically there are going to be no barriers for the Russians to continue their offensive operation further from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, and obviously Pokrovsk will fall as well without any fortifications. So this is the main problem that Ukrainians currently faced in this direction. Now we are moving further to few Ukrainian geolocations. The Ukrainians published the video how they managed to discover the Russian Grad systems, multi-launch rocket systems Grads in the vicinity of Avdiivka, those systems that the Russians were using to support the Russian offensive forces, and as a result of HIMARS strikes, those 2 systems were destroyed. This is a very important video because, as you can see, these Grad systems are located not very far from the combat line. So the distance between Avdiivka and these 2 Grad systems is around, let's say, 6 kilometers. So to attack these Grad systems, the Ukrainians don't need to use HIMARS. But the problem is that the Ukrainians can't use artillery systems against Grad because like everything is under Russian fire artillery control. And the only possible solution for the Ukrainians is to use Grad systems. So it's very poor and very bad situation for the Ukrainians. And basically the Russians do have complete artillery superiority on Donetsk and Avdiivka direction. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 240 soldiers. Now we are moving to the new front line, to Horlivka. The Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours tried to improve their positions in the vicinity of the Terikon, the landfill, and the Ukrainians were planning to improve their positions by attacking the Russian forces in Horlivka, and for those purposes the Ukrainians tried to send more and more reinforcements and reserves in direction of Terikon and in direction of the villages and the cities and the trenches in this area. But the Russians, as I understand, because during the previous 24 hours we have almost received nothing from Avdiivka and Bakhmut, so I suppose that the Russians took a decision to use operational reserves of Bakhmut and to send them to Horlivka to stabilize the entire situation. And basically the Russians have redeployed one of the most experienced and powerful forces, and that forces started working out with this situation. And for example, the Ukrainians tried to send some reserves, but the Russians during the night period of time managed to discover the movement of the Ukrainian forces, and basically they destroyed them, maybe even with stealth flamethrower systems. The Ukrainians had significant losses, and like half of the squad, half of the forces that were involved in that redeployment were destroyed, and those who managed to survive returned back to Toretsk, New York agglomeration. On the northern part, the Ukrainians tried to do the same, but they were trying to storm and to capture another landfill, another Terikon. For those purposes, they use a very significant number of forces, up to 60 soldiers. The Russians managed to discover them during the daylight, and then they started basically bombing them with FPV drones, and another Ukrainian platoon, now a group of Ukrainian forces, was destroyed, and they were also forced to step back from this territory. So the Ukrainians were defeated. They had very nice chances, good chances to improve their positions in Horlivka and basically to break the Russian plans, maybe not in Avdiivka, but at least in Bakhmut, but the Ukrainians were defeated and were forced to step back. After that, the Russians continued the clearing operation of the Terikon by FPV drone strikes, and as a result of strikes, the Russians managed to suppress and destroy and to reduce the Ukrainian forces in this area, those who managed to survive. And currently, according to information we have, this territory is in the gray zone. For now, I'm not going to change the color of this Terikon, of this landfill, because we have the geolocations that there are Ukrainians, but as soon as we got some videos with the Russians, that we will change the map. So that's where the events that took place on the Horlivka front line. When talking about Artyomovsk-Bakhmut direction, the Russians continue offensive operation from Bakhmut in direction of the hill 215.7, so in this area. And according to information we have, the Russians managed to establish control over a few more square meters closer to the main fortification area, and also the Russians started, let's say, FPV drone bombardment and artillery bombardment of the trenches, of the main trenches in this area. So this is something like artillery and FPV drone preparation before the next clearing operation. So also I expect that the next week the Russians will make another attempt to attack this territory, and the Russians, as I understand, are going to attack along this line, let's say. So they will using the shortest way, the shortest distance, and if the Russians of course are able to establish control over this territory, of course the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from Klishchevka, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from Andreevka, from every single, let's say, building and the fortification, shelter and stronghold that located on the south from that fortification. So the situation is critical. Furthermore, the Russians continue attacking bombardments of the villages and dachas and the residential area on the southwest of Bakhmut, of Artyomovsk. So this also might be a part of preparation before the next waves of attack in direction of Ivanovska. So the Russians need to resolve this issue, because currently the Russians have a concentration of around 40,000 soldiers in this area, and the reason of this concentration is that Ukrainians have their foothold and positions on the Russian side of the canal, and if the Russians can force the Ukrainians to step back from this side of the canal, of course they will be able to reduce the number of forces in this direction and to use them, let's say, in Avdiivka or maybe in the Kupiansk or Lyman front line, because they will have, of course, reserves, but they don't need to keep 40,000 soldiers to keep this territory when there are no Ukrainians on this side of the canal. Now we are moving to Kupiansk-Lyman front lines. The clashes continue in Kremenная forest. The Russians continue bombardments and attacks of Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches in the forest. As a result of clashes on Lyman direction, the Ukrainians lost 30 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. So as you can see, there is the activity was reduced to almost till zero during this weekend, and the same story we can find in Kupiansk direction. The Russians reported that they launched an offensive operation, another offensive operation. According to the Russians, 32nd and 54th Brigade have already lost their combat capabilities. We haven't received even a single geolocation from this territory, and the level of loss of the Ukrainians were around 70 soldiers and 2 armored vehicles on this direction. So as you can see, the Russians continue pressure, but the Ukrainians are not going to surrender because, one more time, they have a core army of nationalists who will never, let's say, give their power back to anybody, who will never stand on the combat line and fight with the Russians. And the only purpose of this core army is to control Zelensky and to control parliament, to control the process inside of Ukraine. And if something goes bad for them, they will replace, change, and do whatever they like. The main problem with Ukraine is not support Zelensky or whatever. The main problem is core Ukrainian army. It's around 20-30,000 of people, but they can control everything, every single process. And now this core army required the Ukrainian parliament, the Ukrainian authorities, to start mobilization among 18 years old people, young men. So we'll see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.